Have you ever wondered why some prayers seem to shake heaven while others barely make a ripple? What if the difference isn't in how long you pray, how loud you speak, or how desperate you feel, but in understanding the principles that govern prayer itself? Imagine unlocking a level of intimacy and authority where every word aligns with divine purpose, where your prayers don't just request but enforce what heaven has already ordained. Today, we're about to explore how prayer can become a skill, a system, and a partnership with God that transforms not only your life, but the world around you. Prayer being a skill means it is not an automatic outcome of sincerity or good intentions, but a discipline that develops through understanding, repetition, and growth in spiritual intelligence. Many people assume prayer works only by emotion or desperation, but true effectiveness in prayer comes the same way mastery comes in any serious pursuit: learning the principles, practicing them consistently, and allowing correction over time. Just as no one becomes fluent in a language by desire alone, no one becomes effective in prayer without learning how spiritual communication functions. Prayer has structure, order, and spiritual laws that govern results, and ignorance of these laws often leads to frustration rather than transformation. When prayer is treated as a learnable skill, believers move from random utterances to intentional communication that carries authority and clarity. Mastery in prayer develops when a person understands timing, posture of heart, alignment with divine will, and the power of faith-filled declarations rather than repetitive speech. Growth in prayer also requires discipline, because skill is built when prayer is practiced, even when feelings are absent. Consistency trains the spirit to remain sensitive and responsive, sharpening discernment and increasing spiritual accuracy. Over time, prayer begins to shift from effort to flow, where words are guided by understanding rather than struggle. Revelation plays a crucial role in this process, because spiritual knowledge refines how prayer is offered and what is expected. As understanding increases, confidence replaces uncertainty, and prayer becomes bold without being careless. Mastery does not mean perfection, it means progression, where each season of prayer builds on the previous one, deepening intimacy and authority. This is why those who have mastered prayer often speak less but accomplish more, because their words are rooted in alignment rather than noise. Learning prayer also teaches restraint, knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when silence itself is an act of faith. As skill increases, prayer shifts from asking endlessly to enforcing spiritual realities already established by divine authority. The believer begins to recognize that prayer is not about convincing God, but about aligning with what is already ordained. Through learning and practice, prayer becomes precise, intentional, and effective, shaping outcomes rather than reacting to them, transforming prayer from a routine into a powerful expression of spiritual mastery. Authority in prayer is not produced by how loud a person speaks or how intense their emotions become, but by how aligned they are with divine order and spiritual truth. Many assume that shouting, tears, or long hours automatically move heaven, yet prayer operates on legality, not emotional pressure. Spiritual authority flows from position, and position is determined by alignment. When a person is rightly aligned in identity, obedience, and understanding, their words carry weight in the spirit even when spoken quietly. Alignment means standing in agreement with divine will, purpose, and principles rather than trying to force outcomes through human effort. When alignment is absent, prayer becomes exhausting and repetitive. When alignment is present, prayer becomes authoritative and effective. Emotion may accompany prayer, but it is never the source of its power. True authority is calm, confident, and precise because it is backed by truth rather than desperation. Alignment also involves understanding one's spiritual identity, because authority cannot exceed identity. A person who does not know who they are spiritually will struggle to pray with confidence, often begging instead of declaring. In contrast, those who understand their position approach prayer from agreement, not insecurity. Authority in prayer grows as alignment deepens, and alignment deepens through obedience, consistency, and submission to spiritual principles. When life choices contradict prayer requests, authority is weakened because alignment has been compromised. This is why some prayers feel sincere but lack results, not because heaven is silent, but because spiritual order has been ignored. Prayer works best when the heart, actions, and words agree with divine intent. Alignment also requires patience because timing is part of spiritual order. A prayer prayed too early or too late can lack effectiveness, even if it is passionate. Authority respects timing, process, and purpose. When a person learns to pray from alignment, they stop trying to manipulate outcomes and start enforcing spiritual realities. Their prayers become shorter, clearer, and more confident. Volume decreases, but impact increases. Emotional energy is replaced by spiritual certainty. This kind of prayer does not strive to convince God, but stands firmly on what is already established. Alignment transforms prayer from a plea into a command rooted in truth. Over time, the believer discovers that authority is not something to be worked up, but something to be stood in. When alignment becomes a lifestyle, prayer stops being a struggle and becomes a natural expression of spiritual authority that consistently produces results. Consistency in prayer shapes spiritual strength more reliably than moments of intense effort, because the spirit is trained by repetition, not by occasional extremes. Many people pray passionately only when pressure rises, emergencies appear, or emotions overflow, but intensity without consistency creates instability. A life built on occasional spiritual highs cannot sustain authority or clarity. Consistent prayer forms rhythm, and rhythm produces endurance. When prayer becomes a daily discipline rather than a seasonal reaction, the spirit grows familiar with divine presence and becomes steady in response. Consistency teaches the heart to remain aligned even when circumstances are calm, preventing prayer from being reduced to crisis management. Over time, regular prayer builds spiritual muscle, allowing a believer to carry weight in the unseen realm without strain. Intense prayer moments may feel powerful, but they often fade if they are not supported by daily devotion. Consistency anchors prayer in obedience rather than emotion, ensuring that prayer continues even when feelings are absent. This is where true mastery begins, because spiritual growth is not sustained by excitement but by commitment. When prayer is consistent, sensitivity increases gradually, discernment sharpens naturally, and confidence grows quietly. The believer becomes spiritually alert, not because of emotional stimulation, but because of disciplined alignment. Consistency also protects prayer from burnout, since the burden is spread across time instead of concentrated in emotional bursts. Those who pray consistently learn how to pace themselves spiritually, understanding that longevity matters more than momentary display. Over time, prayer stops feeling forced and becomes woven into daily life, influencing thoughts, decisions, and reactions. Consistency trains the spirit to recognize divine promptings quickly, making prayer more responsive and less reactive. While intense prayer can break resistance, consistent prayer prevents resistance from forming in the first place. It establishes spiritual order before chaos arrives. A consistent prayer life also builds trust because it reflects faithfulness rather than desperation. Heaven responds to patterns, not panic. When prayer is steady, results may appear gradual, but they are lasting. Intensity may impress people, but consistency transforms lives. Those who maintain a regular prayer rhythm often experience fewer crises, not because challenges disappear, but because spiritual preparedness increases. Consistent prayer strengthens spiritual awareness, enabling believers to discern battles early and respond wisely. Over time, this discipline produces quiet authority, where prayer becomes effective without noise or strain. Mastering prayer is ultimately revealed not in how strongly one prays on difficult days, but in how faithfully one prays on ordinary days when nothing seems urgent and no one is watching. Prayer goes beyond speaking words toward God. It involves understanding the mechanisms by which heaven responds to human communication. Many people focus only on expression, believing that prayer is effective simply because words are spoken sincerely. Yet prayer functions as a two-way spiritual engagement governed by divine order. Heaven does not respond randomly or emotionally, but according to established spiritual principles. When a person understands how heaven responds, prayer becomes intentional rather than hopeful. Speaking without understanding response is like sending messages without knowing the language of the receiver. Effective prayer requires awareness of how divine systems operate, including timing, alignment, authority, and faith. Heaven responds to faith-filled agreement, not repetition alone. This is why some prayers feel powerful yet produce little change, while others spoken quietly produce visible results. Understanding response teaches a believer that prayer is not about informing God, but about enforcing what aligns with divine will. When heaven responds, it does so through channels, processes, and spiritual laws that require cooperation on earth. Prayer works best when the one praying knows what to expect, how to stand, and how to interpret spiritual signals. Without this understanding, people may misread silence as rejection or delay as denial. Heaven's response is often progressive rather than instant, and understanding this protects believers from discouragement. Prayer also involves listening, discerning, and adjusting, because response is not always immediate or dramatic. Sometimes heaven responds by giving instruction, sometimes by shifting circumstances, and sometimes by changing the one praying. When a believer understands this, prayer becomes relational rather than transactional. Instead of repeating requests endlessly, the person learns to watch for direction, correction, or confirmation. Understanding heaven's response also brings responsibility, because answered prayer often requires action. Heaven may release power, but execution often happens through human obedience. This understanding transforms prayer from a wish into a partnership. Prayer becomes strategic when a believer learns how to pray according to spiritual laws rather than personal urgency. Words gain precision, expectations become realistic, and faith matures. The believer learns when to persist, when to wait, and when to change approach. This awareness eliminates frustration and builds confidence, because prayer is no longer guesswork. Understanding response also sharpens discernment, allowing believers to recognize when prayer has been answered spiritually even before physical manifestation appears. Prayer then becomes a means of enforcing spiritual reality into the natural realm rather than pleading for possibility. When this level of understanding develops, prayer shifts from speaking alone to engaging heaven with clarity, expectation, and spiritual intelligence, producing outcomes that align with divine order rather than emotional effort. Spiritual sensitivity is not an automatic trait, but a capacity that is developed. And sustained prayer is one of the primary ways this capacity is sharpened. When prayer is practiced consistently over time, the inner senses become more alert to spiritual realities that are often missed in a distracted life. Many struggle to discern direction, recognize spiritual shifts, or perceive divine promptings because their spiritual senses are dull, not because guidance is unavailable. Sustained prayer quiets internal noise, creating space for clarity and perception to develop. As the mind becomes disciplined and the heart becomes still, subtle impressions, convictions, and promptings become easier to recognize. This sharpening does not happen overnight. It is the result of repeated exposure to divine presence through prayer. Over time, the spirit becomes familiar with the atmosphere of alignment, making it easier to detect when something is out of order. Prayer functions like training for the inner man, strengthening awareness the same way repetition sharpens physical skills. As spiritual sensitivity increases, reactions become more accurate and decisions are made with greater wisdom. Sustained prayer also heightens discernment, allowing believers to distinguish between emotional impulses and genuine spiritual direction. Without this sensitivity, people often mistake urgency for instruction or fear for guidance. Prayer trains the heart to respond from peace rather than pressure. This clarity reduces error and prevents unnecessary struggles. Spiritual sensitivity also enhances timing, because prayer aligns a person with divine rhythm. Knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to remain silent often determines the success of decisions. Sustained prayer fine-tunes this awareness, preventing premature actions or delayed obedience. As sensitivity grows, prayer itself becomes more precise, because words are shaped by understanding rather than assumption. The believer begins to pray in agreement with what is being revealed rather than guessing what to ask. This deepens confidence and reduces frustration. Spiritual sensitivity also strengthens conviction, making it easier to recognize warning signals before problems escalate. Many crises could be avoided if early spiritual signals were recognized and acted upon. Sustained prayer keeps the spirit alert, preventing complacency and spiritual dullness. Over time, sensitivity becomes a lifestyle, influencing thoughts, conversations, and choices. Prayer no longer feels like a separate activity but a continual state of awareness. When spiritual sensitivity is sharpened through sustained prayer, life becomes less reactive and more discerning, allowing believers to navigate complex situations with clarity, wisdom, and spiritual accuracies. Results in prayer are governed by spiritual laws rather than religious effort, meaning that sincerity alone does not guarantee effectiveness. Many people pray faithfully and consider their effort proof that answers must follow, yet effort without understanding often leads to disappointment. Spiritual laws function the same way natural laws do. They operate consistently regardless of emotions, intentions, or desperation. Prayer does not override these laws, it works through them. When these principles are understood and honored, prayer produces predictable results. When they are ignored, prayer may feel sincere but remain unproductive. Religious effort focuses on how much energy is expended, while spiritual law focuses on alignment, faith, authority, and order. Heaven responds to accuracy, not exhaustion. This is why two people can pray similar prayers yet experience vastly different outcomes. One may be aligned with spiritual principles, while the other relies solely on effort. Laws such as faith, authority, timing, obedience, and alignment determine how prayer manifests. Faith is not wishful thinking, but confident agreement with divine truth. Authority comes from position, not emotion. Timing determines whether prayer activates or delays manifestation. Obedience sustains results beyond the initial answer. When prayer ignores these realities, it becomes ritualistic rather than effective. Religious effort often tries to compensate for lack of understanding by increasing volume, repetition, or intensity. Spiritual laws require clarity, agreement, and proper posture. This does not make prayer mechanical, it makes it intentional. Understanding spiritual laws shifts prayer from hoping something happens to knowing why something will happen. It also removes frustration, because unanswered prayer is no longer seen as rejection, but as misalignment that can be corrected. This understanding matures believers, helping them adjust their approach instead of doubting divine faithfulness. Spiritual laws also protect prayer from manipulation, because they cannot be bypassed by pressure or emotion. Prayer that violates order cannot produce lasting results, even if it seems successful temporarily. This is why some answers fade quickly or create new problems. The law governing sustainability was ignored. When believers learn to pray according to spiritual laws, prayer becomes stable, repeatable, and fruitful. Confidence replaces anxiety, and expectation becomes grounded rather than emotional. Results are no longer surprising but consistent. Prayer then becomes less about pleading and more about enforcing divine order. Religious effort asks, struggles, and hopes. Prayer aligned with spiritual law declares, aligns, and stands. Over time, this understanding produces maturity, where believers stop measuring prayer by how hard it feels and start measuring it by how accurately it aligns with divine principles that govern results in the spiritual and natural realms. Every level a person enters in life introduces new responsibilities, pressures, and spiritual demands, and each of these levels requires a corresponding depth of prayer mastery to sustain it. Growth in life without growth in prayer creates imbalance, because increase always attracts resistance. When responsibilities expand but spiritual capacity remains the same, strain and confusion often follow. Prayer mastery is what stabilizes progress, ensuring that advancement does not become overwhelming. Many people pray effectively at one stage of life but struggle at the next, not because prayer has failed, but because the demands of the new level exceed their current spiritual discipline. Each season requires greater clarity, stronger discernment, and deeper alignment, all of which are developed through prayer. As influence increases, so does accountability, and prayer becomes the system that keeps motives pure and decisions accurate. Without this mastery, success can become a burden rather than a blessing. Higher levels of life expose deeper issues, unseen battles, and complex challenges that cannot be handled with shallow prayer. Prayer mastery evolves as a person learns to engage with greater wisdom, authority, and restraint. At early stages, prayer may focus on personal needs and survival, but as levels increase, prayer must expand to include responsibility for others, purpose, and long-term impact. This shift requires maturity, because prayer becomes less self-centered and more strategic. Each level also demands greater emotional stability, because leadership, visibility, and responsibility amplify pressure. Prayer mastery provides that stability, grounding the heart and preserving peace. Without it, stress increases and decisions become reactive. As levels rise, timing becomes more critical and mistakes carry greater consequences. Prayer sharpens sensitivity timing, helping a person act wisely rather than impulsively. It also builds endurance, because higher levels require sustained faithfulness, not momentary enthusiasm. Mastery in prayer ensures that strength is renewed consistently, preventing burnout. Those who neglect prayer as life advances often rely on experience, intelligence, or connections, which eventually prove insufficient. Prayer keeps perspective clear, reminding the believer that growth is sustained by divine support, not human effort alone. Each new level requires deeper trust and surrender because control becomes less possible. Prayer facilitates this surrender, aligning the heart with divine purpose rather than personal ambition. As prayer mastery grows, life becomes more ordered, decisions more deliberate, and progress more sustainable. Advancement without prayer mastery may be impressive, but it is fragile. Growth supported by deepening prayer is stable, enduring, and capable of carrying long-term impact across seasons, responsibilities, and increasing influence. Prayer positions a believer to partner with divine purposes rather than merely seeking personal solutions. When prayer is understood as partnership, its focus shifts from self-preservation to participation in what God intends to accomplish on earth. Many people approach prayer primarily as a means of escape from problems or a way to secure blessings, but true partnership begins when prayer aligns the heart with divine agendas. In this posture, prayer becomes less about changing God's mind and more about yielding to divine direction. Partnership requires availability, obedience, and alignment because God works through willing participants rather than independent actors. Prayer prepares the believer to receive instruction, correction, and empowerment to carry out divine will. As this understanding deepens, prayer becomes mission-centered rather than need-centered. The believer begins to ask different questions, seeking purpose instead of relief. This shift transforms prayer into a channel through which divine intentions are released into the natural realm. Partnership also brings responsibility because answers to prayer often require human corporeity. God may release clarity, resources, or power, but execution depends on obedience. Prayer therefore positions the believer not only to receive but to act. This alignment sharpens discernment, ensuring that actions reflect divine timing and intent. Partnership in prayer also reshapes priorities as personal desires are gradually aligned with divine purpose. Over time, prayer molds character, ensuring that power is matched with humility and authority with responsibility. When prayer is practiced as partnership, it deepens trust because the believer recognizes that outcomes are not solely dependent on personal effort but on cooperation with divine wisdom. This awareness removes anxiety and fosters peace, even in uncertainty. Partnership also expands perspective, allowing believers to see beyond immediate circumstances and understand their role in a larger plan. Prayer becomes a place of preparation, equipping individuals to influence their environment positively. Through partnership, prayer stops being reactive and becomes proactive, addressing issues before they manifest fully. The believer begins to pray for alignment, wisdom, and impact rather than only for solutions. This kind of prayer carries weight because it is rooted in purpose. Over time, the line between prayer and action becomes seamless as decisions flow naturally from communion. Prayer then becomes a lifestyle rather than an event. When believers are positioned as partners through prayer, they move with confidence, clarity, and responsibility, knowing they are not merely asking for intervention, but actively participating in the unfolding of divine purposes on earth through their obedience, faith, and alignment. Mastery in prayer is not about how much effort you put in, but how deeply you understand, align, and cooperate with divine principles. As you grow in consistency, sensitivity, and authority, prayer transforms from a routine into a powerful channel of purpose and impact. Every level of life you step into demands deeper prayer, and every answered prayer positions you to participate in God's unfolding plan. Remember, prayer is not just about asking, it's about standing in alignment, exercising authority, and partnering with heaven. Commit to this journey and watch your life and those around you shift in ways you never imagined.